Thank you. Thank you. Reminder. So we are just going to mute everyone while I'm at it. So there's some background noise. All right. So we're talking about thou shalt continually communicate. And I apologize if you're watching the recording, but we had started off with a story about a couple that determined fairly early on in the relationship that they would never use the silent treatment on each other. And I think that's a very wise thing. I think every marriage needs to make that a commandment in the home, that they will never use the silent treatment. So this commandment puts a positive spin on that and says, thou shalt continually communicate. So that by default means you're not allowed to use the silent treatment. That's, I think that's a very unchristian, and it's not something we should ever do to someone. So the critical factor, of course, is communication. People give all kinds of reasons why they believe a certain marriage will work out. They say, oh, they have so much in common, or they both come from such good families, or they're both such solid Christian people. Now, all these are great reasons and certainly can contribute to a couple's success. But I strongly believe that one factor above all others can make or break a marriage. If a couple makes this area a priority, they likely will enjoy an intimate and meaningful relationship for life. If they neglect it, chances are they'll wind up in a miserable union if the marriage lasts at all. What's the single factor? Communication. Just because two people that are Christians get married, they shouldn't assume that everything's going to be smooth sailing. You're still human beings. So there's this whole very, very important thing called communication that makes a relationship work. And without that, it doesn't matter how much you love God, your marriage will suffer without it. So talk to any number of happily married couples and you'll find one common thread: good communication. On the other hand, if you were to survey an average group of divorced men and women, more than likely you discover that a breakdown in communication lies at the heart of most marital split-ups. Certainly you'd hear of infidelity and irreconcilable differences and an assortment of other reasons. But in most cases, with a little probing, you would discover these reasons all stem from a core problem, and that is poor communication. Ed Young says, if you could sit with me as I listen to couples who have suffered through prolonged marital unhappiness or divorce, you would hear these or similar questions. When did we stop communicating? Why didn't we talk anymore the way we used to? Where did we go wrong? Too many couples unconsciously buy into the idea that when they say I do, live under the same roof, eat from the same table, and sleep in the same bed, they automatically grow in intimacy. Yet the simple fact is that if these two people are not communicating, if they're merely occupying adjoining space, they're not growing together, but growing apart. Good communication between a husband and wife takes time and effort. It's so critically important that I've made it the third commandment of marriage: thou shalt continually communicate. So there's some really key important things here. Don't assume that you're communicating just because you're in the same space. Sure, you're talking, but are you really communicating? And what are you communicating? We're going to get into some of that. So understanding marital communication, good communication, of course, does require the use of words, but there's much more to it than that. Nonverbal factors such as tone of voice, facial expression, body language can affect communication far more than one's choice of words. So he gives the example, he says, what if I was to say to you in a genuinely friendly tone of voice, you're the nicest person I've ever met? You would probably feel complimented. But if I used sarcasm and said the exact same words, you would get the opposite impression, that I don't think you're nice at all. In fact, I think you're the least nice person I've ever seen. Because tone matters. Tone matters. And this is so true in marriage. You can say all the right words, but if it's in the wrong tone of voice, it's going to matter. So since communication is far more than the verbal delivery of information, establishing effective dialogue can be a complex and challenging task. So let's first look at what hinders good communication. So number one, we want to look at these obstacles to good communication. So going back to the beginning, we think of the Garden of Eden. Things have never been the same since Adam and Eve plunged headlong into sin. To prompt the fall, the serpent used negative communication, namely deception, Genesis 3, verse 1, and then verses 4 to 5. He used a rhetorical question. Indeed, has God said, you shall not eat the tree? or of every tree of the garden. Of course, he's trying to deceive Eve. He twisted God's words to imply God was depriving her of all fruit. And he plain lied about the outcome and God's motives. So after Eve had been duped into eating the forbidden fruit, she encouraged Adam to try it. Half-truths, manipulation, and downright dishonesty have become tools of communication between men and women ever since. So there's been this, Adam and Eve picked it up from Satan in the garden, and that's been the way human beings have communicated with each other ever since. So to improve communication, a couple needs to consider the obstacles blocking it. Any number of activities or commitments can consume a couple's time and energy and keep them from communicating fully and deeply. Even the most positive and worthwhile things can drain away precious time and energy. And I think that's an important point, that we want to make sure that we're giving our spouse the best of our time, the best of our energy, that it's not leftovers. So that brings us to the number one thing, and that is schedules. One recent poll indicated that 61% of Americans would trade money for more time. Tragically, many husbands and wives have traded their marriages for their schedules. Certainly, we live in a busy world that never seems to slow down. If anything, it gets busier. Work, appointments, errands, recreation, children, extended families, all these and more contribute to the communication vacuum between husbands and wives. And I would add church in there, that we have a lot happening at our church and so on. We don't expect anyone to go to everything, but we do, 3 a week is a good rule. But there's a balance that has to be in the schedule too. Many marriages appear happy and healthy simply because the husband and wife have so much going on. But a couple can quickly find themselves out of time, out of energy, and drained of emotion, and anything more than the most basic communication can seem all but impossible. Healthy communication cannot occur and flourish in a marriage in which partners fail to take time away from all the busyness to be with each other. And if they can't build communication, they can't build their marriage. One challenge in Sudbury is there's a lot of shift work here. If you've got a couple where one works morning shift and one works afternoon shift, and they only see each other for 6 hours at night, that's tough to maintain for any length of time and have a solid relationship. And it's important to have time together, and time is so important. And of course, when you have a busy schedule, what do you do with the remaining time? I heard a term this week, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically revenge scrolling or revenge viewing of YouTube. They call it revenge scrolling because you're taking revenge on your schedule, and all the time that you didn't have to relax and spend time on the internet or whatever, you're now taking it late at night, and it's robbing you of sleep. So people feel like they've got no time, so they take it from their sleep, and they end up staying up way later at night than they should on the internet because they're revenge scrolling or they're revenge surfing. They're taking revenge on their schedule because they feel deprived because they're so busy, and now it's just making the problem worse because now they lack sleep the next day. So beware of that. That brings us to the next thing here, and that is children. Well, children certainly are the most important result of intimacy in marriage. They can also be the biggest hindrance to it. Someone once said that children are the best form of birth control. The more kids you have, the less likely you are to have any. Children bring great blessings to a marriage, yet they also bring huge responsibilities. Perhaps the biggest responsibilities God entrusts to couples. Parents provide the primary source of support for these little human beings for the better part of 2 decades and possibly longer. Beyond all doubt, children make it more difficult for husbands and wives to make time for intimacy and communication. And of course, there's no more demanding creature on planet Earth than a newborn baby. Ask any parent. That baby has #1 priority, and when it's hungry, it needs fed. When it needs changed, you can't put it off half an hour. There's things that have to be done right away. So there's, with kids, the kind of attention that's needed will change, but not necessarily the amount. As babies, children need constant care. As toddlers and preschoolers, they need help to develop the ability to talk and read and interact socially. During the elementary school years, children need emotional and educational support. When the adolescent years roll around, parents must provide untold hours and endless varieties of support and advice. I think society has sold us the lie that you only need to pay attention to your kids till they're old enough to go to daycare. And we now have children that are being raised by the state and being indoctrinated in all kinds of filth and perversion and everything else. The big thing this week is Disney, but what if we just reoriented society around making time for kids too? That's so important, but don't let it come at the expense of your marriage. I've seen many people do this, and I know I've mentioned Jordan Peterson before. He's got some good stuff on this, that if you spend all your effort on trying to make sure everything's perfect for your kids and you at the neglect of your spouse, when your marriage suffers, your children will suffer more. Children can survive a lot when they have a strong relationship with their parents, and their parents have a strong relationship with each other and with God. If there's strife in the home between the parents, it doesn't matter how much you're doing for your kids, that's affecting them more than if they didn't get to go to soccer or whatever. The number one thing you can do for your kids is have a strong relationship with your spouse and with God. That's been proven scientifically. That's not just me saying that. that's been well proven. And I could go into a lot of things on parenting, but we're not talking about parenting tonight. But it's just so important that there's a strong, stable, emotional environment for your kids to grow up in, and it will prevent a lot of heartache later if your kids are able to have that peace growing up. And that kind of brings us to the whole thing about when they're in their teens, they'll be able to trust you and talk to you and ask for your advice and that sort of thing too. So anyway, all of this takes time away from your spouse. Indeed, the attention your children require can lead to their becoming the center of your life to the exclusion of marital communication and intimacy. And that's a danger that every parent must watch out for, that your kids are not there to replace your spouse. That's especially moms, be careful that you don't neglect your husband just because kids are in the picture. Finally, when the last child leaves home, and eventually they do, the empty nest syndrome sets in. A husband and wife are left with whatever relationship they built between one another while the children lived at home. Ed Young says, I've seen it time and time again, couples with nothing to talk about, nothing to share, without major work, such a marriage can land in serious trouble. Their whole life, they've been just focused on their kids, and now their kids are in college, and they're looking across the table at each other and wondering who the stranger is that they live with. Nothing left to talk about, and nothing in common. They've built their own lives separately during this whole child rearing phase, and that's a tragedy. That's but that's an obstacle to communication. You're going to have to be conscious about making sure that there's time. So the children is the next one, and that brings us to number 3, obstacles to communication. I've kind of hinted at this before. Television, internet, and your smartphone, or texting or whatever. He says, I hit a nerve every time I describe this third obstacle to communication. It's amazing, even alarming, how many people cannot seem to function without TV. Stephen Seplow and Jonathan Storm, writing in the Philadelphia Inquirer, reported about 40% of all the hours not committed to working, eating, sleeping, or doing chores is consumed by TV viewing for many Americans. And don't think just because we're apostolic and don't really have TV that makes it different for us, because nowadays people are on their phones. This has replaced TV. I'll just say it, that your phone has replaced TV, that it's still media. It might not be television, it might not be the things we preached against in the 80s, but YouTube has become just as common. You can spend just as many hours on YouTube as people used to spend on TV, and we used to, say, oh, well, all those worldly people on TV, and yet what's happened to us? Oh, well, I was watching a Christian program. Very well, but how much time did it take? And how many of them? Oh, I watched, 3 hours of preaching. Okay, and that's good. But if you do that every day to the neglect of your spouse, you can't spiritualize away the fact that you're stealing time from your relationship. So I'm just saying it like it is here, but don't jump to conclusions. I spend time and watching preaching online, and I watch different things online, whatever. I do spend time on my phone. I freely admit that, probably more than I need to. I've actually got a timer on my phone that keeps track for me to make sure that I don't go over a certain amount. I have time limiting settings on certain apps so that I don't spend too much time on Facebook or different things like that. There's ways you can make sure that you're not. So there's good and bad here, but the point is we don't want to rob our spouse of our time by spending it on entertainment, media of any kind, whether that's TV, YouTube, Facebook, whatever. Who knows how many Americans have become addicted to television? Hundreds of thousands, millions? Could you be one of them? Find out, try and experiment. Turn off the set for a week. If you're used to coming home, plopping into a recliner with a dinner tray in your lap and grabbing the remote for a quiet getaway of channel surfing, then I predict you'll have a tough time turning off the TV, but do it anyway. Then take a walk with your husband or wife and talk about anything and everything. Or in this case, this book's 20 years old and it's obsolete already. Turn off your phone. Spend the time with your wife instead. You know, that can be tough, but that's what you do. I've actually got into the habit of not turning my phone on when I first get up in the morning. Sometimes I don't turn on my phone until 11 o'clock, just because that's when my wife and I are together. She works nights, we have mornings together. There's, you know, sometimes I just forget, but there's, that doesn't need to be my number one priority when I wake up in the morning. So there's ways you can do this. You can block off time. Nothing wrong with being available. I mean, anyone that needs to get a hold of me, they can call our home phone. You know, they know how to reach me. But there's ways to protect your time with your spouse as well. That brings us to number 3, and that is, or sorry, number 4, and that's fear of conflict. And this is a big one. This is a big one, fear of conflict. So if a husband and wife never have any conflicts, they probably aren't communicating. Isn't that wonderful? If a husband and wife never have any conflicts, they probably aren't communicating. Conflict is part of any normal marriage. As long as both partners remain willing and able to communicate, they can overcome conflict and even grow and learn from it. But some people allow their fear of conflict to keep them from effectively communicating with anyone, including their spouse. In our Simbas book that I mentioned a few weeks ago, one of the chapters in there is thou shalt make conflict thy ally. Making conflict a positive thing in your marriage, that you actually use conflict to your advantage to build your relationship, that you fight together for your marriage. You don't fight each other. That's when relationships break down, when it's friendly fire. You want to fight for your marriage together as a team and not against each other. But people have fear of conflict sometimes. Suppose a man grew up in a home where his parents settled conflicts or disagreements according to volume. Whoever yelled the loudest or broke the most dishes won. Such a man might feel afraid to truly communicate, since he associates disagreements with loud or violent outbursts. Or perhaps a woman grew up in a home in which her mother was constantly belittled by verbal put-downs or sarcasm. In her own marriage, such a woman might hesitate to express her thoughts or feelings for fear of being hurt or humiliated. So our upbringing has a lot to do with how we handle or how we perceive conflict. And that's something to be sensitive towards in your spouse. But it's very, very important that we do not allow fear to keep us from addressing conflicts within marriage. And you don't want it to grow bigger than it needs to be. So schedules, children, television, and fear of conflict are all merely 4 of the most common obstacles facing couples who want effective communications in their marriages. If they are to create solid and happy homes, however, husbands and wives must find ways to overcome these hindrances. Successful marriages clear away the obstacles and labor to build layer upon layer of effective communication. It's very important that we build communication. So what is communication? Communication has many different levels. So number 1, the level of communication is cliches, or there might be other ways to define this, but basically, how's it going? You know, how are you today? Young says here, I've discovered that when someone greets me with one of these cliches, he really isn't asking for a report on how things are going. One time I actually stopped the person and began answering the question in detail. You should have seen the shock on his face as he began backing away, making excuses that he was late for a meeting. Now, I don't recommend you doing this. It could lead to an embarrassing situation. But for sake of illustration, I just had to see if what I thought would happen really would, and it did. So it says, "Oh, how are you today?" And you say, "Well, spiritually, I'm doing this way, and physically, I'm this way, and emotionally, I'm this way, and financially, I'm this way." They're going to say too much information. I really didn't need to know all of that, because it's just surface communication. They're really not. They're just being polite. They're not necessarily wanting a detailed report of how you're doing. Now, sometimes they are, and you can tell. A lot of times when I ask people, I'm really wanting to know, how you doing, and I'm not just being polite. So that's one level of communication. If your marriage should have at least that level, but it shouldn't stop there. There's got to be more than that. The second level of communication is just the facts. So at this level, we communicate facts apart from any kind of interpretation or opinion or emotional response. So it's like, well, it's raining today. The meeting is scheduled for 1 o'clock, or it's time to change oil in the car. So there's just different things that you could communicating facts, and couples must communicate facts if they're able to coordinate schedules and plan things and whatever else. So while husbands and wives certainly need to learn how to accurately communicate facts, they can hardly sustain and grow a healthy marriage on this alone. A healthy personal relationship of any kind requires both parties to communicate on still a deeper level, and that is opinions and convictions. So when we communicate an opinion, we begin to give the hearer a glimpse of what makes us tick. In other words, the person discovers not just what we think, but why. Our statements of opinion or conviction reflect our beliefs, our loyalties, personal commitments. By communicating an opinion or conviction, we state a fact and what we believe about that fact. So most often we communicate our opinions or convictions by beginning with statements such as, "I believe that," or "I think that," or "it appears to me that." We're giving our opinion on any subject. So if you're talking with your spouse about a shakeup at the office, the facts might sound like this: "They moved Bill over to accounting and then promoted Francis to take his old position." Well, that's the facts. You can add your opinion by saying, "I think that change is going to make for a smoother running office once we get used to working with Francis." Or, "They shouldn't have treated Bill that way." Those are opinions you could have about what happened. So that's another level of communication. It's at this level of communication that conflicts often arise. When married couples begin to share opinions and convictions, disagreements can develop, which can escalate into arguments. Yet this is not necessarily a bad or unhealthy thing, so long as both sides respect one another and remain willing to work out the disagreements with love. Again, you can disagree, you can have different opinions. It doesn't have to turn into war. You can just say, "Okay, well, that's not the way I see it, but that's cool that you do, whatever." And that brings us to number 4, and that is feelings. And remember, this chapter was written for men. For many men, this is scary. What are you feeling? This question causes most men to break out into a sweat. It seems that we men often struggle at this level. We're great at communicating facts. We're not too bad at voicing our opinions, but most of us labor at sharing our feelings. We know facts, we believe our opinions, but we experience our feelings. And some of us have lost touch with that experience. So going back to our earlier illustration of that office shakeup, your feelings toward Bill's replacement could be relief, joy, anger, or disappointment. You might even feel betrayed. It all depends on your opinions and personal feelings toward Bill or toward the pre-shakeup work situation. So would you be able to describe your feelings to your spouse? Pick your brain question. If you were in that scenario, would you be able to describe how that made you feel? Maybe you're apprehensive about what it's going to be like working under this new manager or something. There's all these different feelings that you might be experiencing. To grow in our marriages, we have to grow in our communication, and to grow in our communication, we must learn to communicate our feelings freely, but with wisdom. And that brings us to our next thing, and that is communicating needs. We reach the deepest level of communication when we communicate our needs. Any marriage counselor, Christian or secular, will insist on the crucial place in the human psyche of communicating needs. Married couples especially have to learn how to communicate at this level. There's nothing wrong with telling your spouse, "I need a hug." Don't assume that they know you need a hug. You gotta tell them sometimes, "I need a hug," Or if you need space, there's nothing wrong with telling your spouse, "Hey, I think I need space right now. Don't just assume that they know that. This is the deepest level of communication, and it's so very important. Fortunately, we communicate our needs almost instinctively beginning as infants. Babies cry when they feel hungry, need changing, or just want to be picked up. As we mature, we learn to verbalize our needs more articulately. Mom, I'm hungry. You tell them, we're communicating needs. As we grow into adulthood, our needs become more complex, as do our ways of communicating those needs. So in marriage, both husband and wife must learn to tactfully but directly communicate their needs. This is where the all-important give and take must occur. Both the husband and wife must learn to communicate their need for affection, for quiet time, for solitary time, for conversation, for encouragement, for all the other needs God intends to provide through marriage. Marriage is about meeting each other's needs. That's why God said it's not good for man to be alone. I'm going to create a helper suitable to him. So, and that works both ways, that there are needs that wives need from their husbands. So communicate those needs, and there can be a beautiful interdependency that can arise in marriage as each partner is supplying the needs of their spouse, all in that framework of this deeper level of communication. This next one's kind of funny, but marriage means communicating with a foreigner. John Gray's best-selling book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, shocked the world with the not especially keen observation that men and women think and react differently to the same situation. And it's not politically correct to say so, but men and women are different. Men and women think differently. Men and women might seem like they're from different planets, but that's maybe a little too far-fetched. Foreign countries is probably more accurate. Just as problems can arise when people from different countries try to communicate, so can problems arise when men and women try to communicate, if they don't put in the effort necessary to truly understand one another. Brother Brent was giving me an example this morning of someone from another country that had asked him to get a spade. And he went and brought back a spade. And the guy looked at it and said, that's not a spade. That's, I don't know what he called it, a round mouth shovel or something, short handle, what we would call a spade here in Canada. And he says, no, in where I come from, a spade has a square end on it. So, we wouldn't say that in Canada, but where he was from, a spade had a square end on it. So it's like, okay, I always thought you could just call a spade, but apparently it depends on what country you're from, what you mean when you say a spade. And that can happen in marriage. And Brent would say, they just kind of had a laugh about it in the workplace because it was funny. But that's kind of the way things can happen in marriage. You've married a foreigner. They really are different from you. That men and women are very, very different, and that's important. And it doesn't make anyone wrong or right. It just means different. When you learn to appreciate those differences, they can really help make up for each other's weaknesses. You can be stronger together. You can encourage one another. You can complement one another. That there's this whole wonderful balance that comes into marriage when a husband and wife are in sync, that you fill in each other's blank spots. I'll put it that way. So that can be just a beautiful thing. So talking and listening straight. The first step may seem obvious, but many married couples struggle with it. Say what you mean. Only one person can control how you communicate, and that person is you. Many couples struggle to communicate effectively because they avoid straight talk. They don't say what they mean, what they need, and what they want. And the fact of the matter is, no one is a mind reader. And it's hilarious to me and sad at the same time that so many couples expect their spouse to be able to read their mind. And I would say that's the number one struggle in communication that I see in couples is don't expect your spouse to be able to read your mind. You have to say it. And this goes for men and women. We talk about men not wanting to talk about their feelings, but a lot of time women have a hard time communicating facts or their needs. They're very good at hinting. The only one that understands hints are other women. So you're gonna have to talk to that guy. He's, if guys, you'll laugh at this. So if your wife says, oh, the garbage is really getting full. Would you say, yeah, that's right, it looks like it is? Or would you say, oh, do you want me to take the garbage out? Yes, waving. Does somebody want to pile in here with a comment? Most guys are just going to say, yeah, that's the facts. You're right. That's correct. Good for you. You noticed it's full. They're not going to think that you're asking them to do anything. They're just going to think, yeah, I have a very observant wife. That's great. I married the right woman. She can notice stuff. They're not thinking beyond what you stated. You just stated the facts. You're like, yeah, that's right. That's correct. Garbage is full. So that's a hint. It's not a, that's kind of an obvious hint. So, maybe some guys would catch that hint and say, okay, well, maybe I should take out the garbage with my wife. Sometimes they're a lot more subtle than that. And there's this whole area of female communication that most guys have no idea about. It's a totally foreign language, and they talk in hints. And most guys, they're completely oblivious to it. They have no idea. And ladies, you need to realize that guys don't talk that language. So my wife and I have actually made a game out of it recently. She's probably a little frustrated that it took me 18 years to notice this. But after almost 20 years of being together, I've started kind of pointing out every time she gives me a hint. And I can't remember what the most recent one was, but we just had a good laugh. She hinted at something, and I said, oh, does that mean you want me to do this? And she's like, yes, please. All cute, and we're just having fun with each other. And I'm like, oh, well, you just gave me a hint. I think I'm learning this language now. I've picked up on this. But I mean, that takes a high level of practice. I mean, we've been at this for 20 years, and I'm just now noticing this. So this is a really refined level of communication in marriage to be able to pick up on that. So I don't expect anyone else to be able to do that. I mean, maybe if you've been married, for longer than 20 years, that you may have some beginnings of learning on that front. But really, that takes a long time to learn that. So really encourage couples to talk straight. Many people find such straight talk uncomfortable, even frightening. They fear to communicate exactly what they need and want, so they drop hints that often go unrecognized. Others go too far with straight talk, issuing their demands with little tact or sensitivity. Still others try the most dysfunctional forms of communication, such as outbursts of anger or the dreaded silent treatment, but nothing beats good, honest, open communication. He gives the illustration. He says, we were on this trip, and his wife said, would you like something to drink? He's like, no, I'm fine. Let's keep going. I'm doing just fine. And they come to another exit, and she says, I'd like something to drink. It's like, oh, well, why didn't you say so? She says, well, I did back there. He's like, no, you didn't. You asked if I wanted anything to drink. I was fine. There's this whole hinting thing going on again. But in her mind, she thought he was going to respond with, no, would you like something to drink? Well, he never even thought to ask. He's just focused on driving. It's never entered his mind. So he just gives a straightforward answer. No, I'm fine. In one way, he says, my wife's question reflected an unselfish approach. She had no intention of manipulating my response. She wanted something to drink, so she threw out her question, hoping I'd respond, well, yes, honey, I'm thirsty. I think we'd like to stop for a Coke. Since those days, however, he says his wife has learned that she'll get much further with me by being direct and to the point, while I've learned to listen more intently when she throws out her suggestions. So there's that whole, it works both ways. So this is generally a gender thing, but ladies learn to be a little more straightforward, and guys learn to pick up on those hints a little more. Do you want or need something from your mate? Then it's up to you to tell him or her what you want. Dropping hints might be fine for Christmas shopping, but regular day-to-day communication demands a more direct approach. Say what you mean what you say, but do so with tact and sensitivity. But I always feel a little leery of those who say, I always say what I mean. You never have to guess with me. People like that often move beyond directness and head toward cruelty or even abuse. I've known married couples whose overly direct communication has devastated their marriages. You can be harsh with tone and just, have this brashness that just comes across as rude. You don't want to be that way with your spouse. No one wants to hear harsh words and say, well, I asked for this, and you haven't done it. There's no place for attacks. But this is where it takes cooperation and listening. Listening is hard work. We had a whole lesson on listening in our last series, but it means listening with the ears, watching with the eyes, understanding how your spouse acts and reacts. You cannot achieve straightforward communication without it. So nothing beats good, honest, open communication. So I guess I didn't have a slide for this, but there's a final section here, learning how your spouse is wired. So the second step is to understand how your spouse is wired. How does your spouse best give and receive messages? This means deciphering if he or she is an auditory person, a visual person, or a feeling person. So auditory people like to communicate verbally. They use words carefully, take great pains to analyze how others use them. The auditory person wants and needs to hear how much he or she is loved. If your husband or wife falls into this category, then you need to frequently speak the words, I love you. Nothing else can replace the sound of those precious words. And one way to find out if your spouse is this way is if they do a lot of talking. They're saying it, that's their love language, for example, if they're speaking words of affirmations because they want to hear them back. And that can be very important to them. The feelings person accurately perceives messages even when little or no visual or verbal communication seems to be occurring. Or sorry, I skipped over visual. So the visual person paints a mental picture of an idea and communicates most effectively on a visual level. This individual may love to hear the words I love you, but he or she wants to see those words demonstrated in loving actions. By and large, many times men are visual creatures. Some people just want to see that you are loving them in some way. We compare this to the love languages. Maybe that's acts of service or gifts or something along those lines, that they're doing something to show their love. It's more than just words. Feelings person accurately perceives messages even when little or no visual or verbal communication seems to be occurring. The feelings individual picks up moods, demeanor, and posture. This person senses what others communicate non-verbally and likely communicates the same way. The problem is they're probably married to someone that does not communicate this way. So again, you have to learn how your spouse is wired. A good car salesman can demonstrate the benefits of knowing and responding to a person's communication wiring. A successful car salesman almost instinctively picks up on what potential car buyers want when they walk through the showroom door. Such a salesman may not consciously think of it this way, but in order to effectively sell his cars, he needs to know how his customer is wired, visual, auditory, or feelings. The salesman might steer the visual customer toward a sleek, flashy-looking vehicle. He'll be quick to point out how sharp the car looks and how great the customer looks behind the wheel. He can be sure to point out the aesthetics of the car's interior, the colors, the appearance of the dashboard, the rich leather upholstery. The visual person might be tempted to purchase such a car simply because of the way it looks. The auditory car buyer, on the other hand, listens to the car, how the engine runs, how the transmission shifts, what the doors sound like when they slam shut, how well the interior muffles noise when the car is moving, how well the entertainment system plays their music. They're dialed in. If it doesn't have a good entertainment system, the rest of the car could be great. They're not going to buy it. They're just focused on all these things. This individual will not buy the car if it doesn't sound right. The feelings customer pays most attention to the image of an automobile. Car makers aim most of their advertisements at these individuals. The majority of television ads these days appeal to emotion. They try to elicit feelings within the potential car buyer. Many of them enjoy great success. I think it was Toyota had a ad a while back, oh, what a feeling, that was their slogan for their car ad, oh, what a feeling. They were appealing to the emotion and the feeling and all this sort of thing. So that's so important to recognize which one of these categories does your spouse fall into and find ways to communicate with them on that level. How are we doing for time? I got to hurry here. So he goes on to talk about how husbands and wives must make it a priority to speak words of affirmation and love to one another. Such heartfelt words can communicate the basis of a whole new level of communication, or provide the basis. So you think of the Proverbs 31 woman, King Lemuel, writing of his faithful wife, her children rise up and bless her, her husband also. He praises her, saying, many daughters have done nobly, but you excel them all. Lemuel wanted his wife to know that although he could have chosen his mate from a large pool of fine, noble women, he chose her and got the cream of the crop. So there's so many things you can do to praise your spouse, brag on them to others. You know, I like to flip this whole narrative on its head. Guys get together, they complain about their wives. I like to talk about, oh, well, that's too bad. You know, I've got a great wife. She's a great cook. She does all this special stuff for me. She's loves me all these special ways. I've been really blessed. I got no complaints. So it kind of flip those things on their head and just, build up your spouse by talking about them behind their back in a good way, that you're praising them. And then those reports come back to them. They're like, wow, they said that about me. Praise is a many splendored thing. So there's different ways you can encourage your spouse, leave notes around the house, whatever, things you can do to just kind of encourage them. Dr. Crane, not his real name, but he reported that an angry woman came in to see him one day. My husband has so hurt me, she fumed. I want not only to divorce him, I want revenge. I want to hurt him. I want to destroy him. Dr. Crane's advice probably surprised the woman. Go home and act as if you really love him. Praise him, honor him, build him up, cook his favorite meals, employ all the creative chemistry you can find in your lovemaking arsenal. Tell him that you just can't resist him, that everything about him is super colossal and fabulous. Play it as if you're madly, helplessly in love with him. Tell him he's your hero and your champion, that he's everything to you. He told the wife to give herself unreservedly to her husband. Once she did that, it truly captivated him with her attention, convinced him that she was just crazy about him, then hit him with both barrels. Tell him I hate you. I have the meanest lawyer in town. He's going to skin you alive. You won't have a penny to your name when I'm through with you. Do that, Dr. Crane finished, and he'll spend the rest of his life in absolute misery because he'll never find anybody to match up with you. That's it, the woman cried. That's what I'm going to do. She went home and acted as if she really loved her husband. Dr. Crane didn't hear from the woman for about 3 months. Finally, he called her and asked, are you ready for the divorce? Divorce, she replied. I'm married to the most wonderful man on the face of the earth. Why would I want a divorce? That is what can happen when we begin praising our mates in both words and action. Severed lines of communication can be repaired and function once more. Even the most difficult marriage can become the loving, supportive institution God meant it to be. And, there's, it's kind of a funny story, but there's something about it that if you just begin to pour your love into your spouse, they will reciprocate. It's going to come back to you. There's an interesting story he tells about a man in the South Pacific Islands where the marriage in different countries is done differently than it is in North America. And over in this area, they would basically go to the father of the bride, and they would have to basically purchase their bride with cows. So, a plain wife would maybe cost you 1 or 2 cows. If you wanted a beautiful wife, 4 or 5 for sure. So this guy, Johnny, he was fairly rich, but everybody told him, if you're on the, oh, you need this, you need to go see Johnny. You need to go see Johnny. He's the guy to talk to. He's the business guy in charge around here. But everybody would kind of snicker when they mentioned his name. They're like, what's the joke? What's everybody talking about? Finally, somebody told me, said, well, the joke on Johnny is that he went and bought this really plain wife for 8 cows. She's, wasn't all that beautiful or anything, but he spent 8 cows on her. And, that's way above. Like, nobody does that, 4 or 5 at the most, but 8? Well, he finally goes to see Johnny, and he was so intrigued, he goes to see him. They talked a while before the guest asked about the unusual high payment for Johnny's wife. Always and forever, Johnny replied, when they speak of marriage settlements, it will be remembered that Johnny Lingo paid 8 cows for Sarita. Just then, a stunningly beautiful woman walked into the little hut, the most gorgeous woman the writer had ever seen. Every inch of her striking frame exuded loveliness, the lilt of her head, the confident way she walked, her smile, her radiance. Johnny looked at his puzzled visitor. Then he said, many things can change a woman, things that happen inside, things that happen outside. But if the thing that matters most is what she thinks about herself, in Kiniwata, Sarita believed she was worth nothing. Now she knows she's worth more than any other woman in the islands. And he communicated to everyone in the islands loud and clear that he loved Sarita and felt proud to make her his bride. He proves that sparkling communication through loving words and actions can achieve what nothing else can. It works in the islands and it can work in your home too. Just shower your spouse with love. That's really what it comes down to. Love them, and let them know that you still think they're the best. I tell my wife all the time, I'd marry you all over again. Just remind them, you're still the one I would pursue. So hopefully you have your notes that I posted in the there's a Dropbox folder that has all the notes each week. So I did post this in there. So there's some reflection questions on there. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being non-existent, 10 being so good, no improvement is possible. Rate the communication in your marriage. How are you and your spouse at communicating your feelings and needs to one another? Describe some hindrances to communication in your marriage. How is your spouse wired? Auditory, visual, feelings. In light of your spouse's wiring, how can you best communicate your love to him or her? First 2 blanks and the last 3. Good question. I'm going to have to reopen that myself. While I am, does anyone have any comments or questions? Everybody's quiet or muted?
Or stop recording.
Oh,